asking for you tonight that you would open your hearts and open your minds to Walden Bello as he shares with us from his wisdom, and that you would say that not in my name, not with my tax dollars, I will not stand silent as people go hungry, as people have no access to basic medicine to cure some basic diseases. I will not stand silently by. Instead, I'm going to open my heart out, and I'm going to stand in solidarity with the people of the Global South. For there is nothing that we can do when we build a global justice movement in this country that we can do without our partners in the South. It is with that solidarity with our partners from the South that we will be able to be successful here in turning around the realities that we face in creating a better world. So this is my hope, this is my prayer. So open your hearts, open your ears, and join me in hearing from this fantastic person.
Walden Bello. You get turned off. Is it on? Walden Bello is Executive Director of Focus of the Global South. He's a prolific writer, a prolific speaker, and a key figure in the global justice movement. Here he is.
I'd like to thank the organizers of this fantastic event, Jill Davis, and all the others who have put so much effort to making this a reality in Missoula. I'd like to thank Marie Clark for the generous words. Let me just say that my first impulse upon being introduced with such expectations from you is I wish that I were in fact with you tonight listening to Njoki Jehu from Kenya, who gave this fantastic speech last night that I was hoping would last on and on and on, and that Kevin Danaher, who also gave a great talk and a very dynamic talk, we're also here to share this stage tonight. Because let me just say that I would much rather listen to them than listen to myself. I had something prepared here, but given the context and the coming together of the elements, I probably should not give this and just give something else. There it goes. About a year ago, I was in a different place in this planet with hundreds of thousands of other people in the very historic city of Genoa. Historic for the wrong reasons, in that it was the city of Christopher Columbus, and that the stigma of being the birthplace of the person who began the colonization and rape of this part of the world. That stigma had remained for Genoa for a long, long time until last year. Because last year, Genoa showed a very different mood, a very different spirit, a very different vision. And that was the vision of another world is possible, another world that is very much unlike the way the world is run right now. And who offered that vision in Genoa? It was hundreds of people from all over the world, from Europe, from the Americas, from Asia, from Africa, people young and old, workers and peasants, professionals from all races, all converging on Genoa to protest the same G7 or G8 summit, Group of 8 summit, the next meeting of which is going to be taking place in Kastananakis in Canada next week. These were people coming from different walks of life with many different preoccupations, many of them maybe with differences on many other issues, but certainly united around one thing. And they were united around the fact that this sort of corporate-driven globalization had gone too far, and that it was time to reverse it, and to reverse it irreversibly. The people who came to Genoa, and it mounted by the day. At first, they expected 50,000 people. The second day, there were 100,000 people. The third day, they were counting 150,000 people. The fourth day, it was out to 200,000 people. And by the final day, we had 300,000 people converging on Genoa. And I remember very well because it was in a place like this, by water, in that case the sea, in which countless of teach-ins were held, in which different aspects of corporate-driven globalization, including the rape of the forests, the way that the corporations had destroyed the environment, the growing inequality in the world, the sinister role of the World Bank and the IMF, the role of the G7 or G8 in terms of mastering our lives. And beyond that, there was a lot of talk about alternatives, the way we should organize the world if in fact we could get rid of those who were organizing it for us. These were visions of equity, visions of a really sustainable future, visions of racial and ethnic equality and cooperation, visions of a demilitarized world. Those were the very powerful visions that were uniting and giving the spirit in Genoa. Now, the people in the establishment, when they came, were a bit apprehensive at first, but not to take any chances, they erected a 20-foot wall in the middle of the city, which would separate the people from their so-called representatives meeting inside. And as the crowds grew and grew, the word went out that the wall might not be enough. And what we saw was they were scared of something, and what they were scared of was peaceful demonstration, the peaceful expression of our views. They were scared of civil disobedience. They were scared of the people. They were scared of the visions and the aspirations that we represented. And it is not surprising that in this context, with these fears, they let the Italian police loose at the people. Genoa marked a watershed in the confrontations with the establishment, in that, whereas in other cities, one could say that the police were definitely aggressive, but generally they were in a sort of a defensive mode. In Genoa, what happened is that they were not only aggressive, they were in a preemptive, aggressive mode. And what happened in those 2 days of the height of the demonstrations in Genoa was that the people would file down the narrow streets of Genoa, and the police would move into them without provocation, attack them with tear gas, attack them with armed personnel carriers, attack them with guns. And we saw how indeed there was one demonstrator who was killed by the police in cold blood in Genoa. It was a battlefield, but it was a battlefield that was provoked by police violence with the full sanction and the support of the ministers, the prime ministers, and the people of the G8 that gathered behind the wall in Genoa as the blood was spilled around the area by their police forces. Let me just say that after the first day, there was so much mayhem, there was so much injury, there was blood all over, but the people came back that evening and said, no, we cannot let them get away with this. No, they think they can intimidate us. No, we will be back tomorrow and back in greater numbers. And what we saw that evening and that midnight was, in order to prevent this, there were police raids. People who were peacefully staying in dormitories were carted off, brought to jail. Those of us who were writing stories to field with our news agencies back home were summarily rounded up and told to sit on the floor, and we were prevented from indeed filing stories. Okay? Yet not any of that was not able to intimidate the fact that the next day there were 300,000 people marching down the streets. And what we had was, against this tremendous show of people's solidarity and people's will and people's determination, they could only respond with more tear gas, with more attacks, with a deliberate effort to kill and to maim. And indeed, I cannot but restate here the very impressive discipline of people, hundreds of thousands strong, marching very close packed, knowing that if they scattered and ran, there would be a stampede. And what they did was that they absorbed the tear gas, they absorbed the smoke, they maintained discipline, and they basically said, you are not going to panic us into stampeding all over ourselves and to create this image of mayhem. No, we will peacefully absorb your blows, and we will show that it is peaceful people who are being attacked, but you cannot deprive us, you cannot kill the vision that we represent. And that was Genoa last year. That was the triumph of peace over brutality. That was the triumph of vision over viciousness. And if these people next week are meeting high up in the Rockies, totally isolated from the constituencies that they represent, I think that this mood was very much captured by those people last year who said, and this is almost word for word, that this might be the last time that they would be able to meet in a city where there might be a democratic assembly of people. In other words, if these meetings will continue to take place, they can only now take place in very isolated fortresses. And because they take place in very isolated fortresses, they in fact underline to the whole world what these people who are supposed to represent us are all about. And that is the fact that they are afraid of us. They are afraid of their very own people. And they're afraid of us because they do not represent us, but they represent a very small minority of the world. And that is the corporate elites, the elites that rule over us, that have tried for so long to blind us, to throw all sorts of smoke screens, to give us free trade, saying free trade is the best for all of us, to say that they're engaged in a war against terrorism. But let me tell you, that once the blindfolds are out, there is no putting them back on. And clearly, what we have seen in the last few years, from Seattle to Genoa to Chiang Mai to Porto Alegre to Missoula, and next week to Canada in Calgary, is a series of manifestations of people bringing down the blindfolds and saying, now we can see, and we can see who the perpetrators are. We can see who the real villains are. And we can also see what the future should really be all about. Now, I think that this is quite a different world from the late 80s and the early 1990s. And these people still have to absorb the fact fully that the world has turned upside down. Why? 1990, 1991, basically they were saying, we have defeated socialism. We have defeated the last rival of unfettered capitalism in the globe. We saw the collapse of the Eastern European socialist regimes, although many of us would not attach the name socialist to many of these governments that fell. But in any event, the early 90s were a period when the establishment was caught up in this very triumphalistic mood that somehow everything would now go their way. As Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, that is a favorite of many of you, once said, what the future held was, there is no alternative. Tina, there is no alternative to global capitalism. And that was what they sought to project at that point in time. The early 90s were a very difficult period for our movement, because in 1995, everything seemed to be going their way, and this was represented by the founding of the World Trade Organization. This was supposed to be the premier organization that would organize and set the rules for global trade, that would set the rules eventually for trade and investment and a whole set of economic regulations and rules that would facilitate corporate exploitation of the world. The World Trade Organization was supposed to be the pinnacle of the gem, the jewel of the global capitalist system. And in 1995, that was ratified, founded with a lot of developing countries and a lot of civil society movements, extremely fearful, worried of what it would bring, but it seemed like they were unstoppable at that point in time. Although underground, among us, in our networks, we were not reconciled to the fact that this process was in fact irreversible. And yet, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, CNN, most of the global media kept on saying to us, globalization is irreversible. Globalization is irreversible. The rule of the corporations is irreversible. You have no choice but to surrender. You have to accommodate. If you're resistant, well, swallow your resistance. Get ready to be co-opted. That seemed to be the message that all of this dominant media were bringing out, and it seemed to be a closed universe. Well, things began to happen a few years after 1995. In 1997, we had the first big setback that they had, and this was the Asian financial crisis. Now, the Asian financial crisis occurred in that part of the globe, in that part of the South, which was supposed to be the success story of how other parts of the third world ought to pattern themselves. These were the Asian tiger economies that were export-oriented, went for international markets, and in the 1990s allowed the free flow of global capital into their economies under the pressure of the International Monetary Fund and under the pressure of the US Treasury Department. And as they lifted the barriers to capital, as they lifted the barriers to the flow of finance capital, tremendous amounts came in to these economies between 1993 and 1997. So much capital came in, an estimated $100 billion. But what did that capital go to? That capital did not go to industry. That capital did not go to essential services. That capital did not go to agriculture. Where that capital went to were those sectors of quick and high profitable return, to real estate, and to the stock market. This was money going after money to make money after money. This was capital that was already detached from production. This was capital that had no excuse for being except to make money and make more capital out of capital. That is that money that's flowed into Asia called hot money. And when naturally these economies became dislocated in a few short weeks, in about 4 weeks, in the summer of 1997, all that capital that had come in over 4 years, 100 billion of it left like lightning. And it left so fast that all the supposedly invulnerable tiger economies came crashing down like dominoes. And I can tell you, it was a horrible crash. In Thailand, for instance, where I work, in 1997, 1 million people were brought down below the poverty line because of the economic crisis. In Indonesia, 21 million people were driven into poverty in just that brief summer of economic crisis. And in Malaysia, and in the Philippines, in Korea, the same sort of contraction of economies, deserted by capital. These countries that had become the cutting edge of globalization wanted so hard to integrate into the global economy. And when the capital went out, they also came down. And the technocrats and the politicians and the industrialists all could not understand what had happened. But what had happened was in fact very simple, that they had lived by the rules of globalization, and the rules of globalization had screwed them in order to favor the interests of northern speculative capital. Now, I bring up the Asian financial crisis because it was the first major crisis that led to what they are now experiencing all over, which is a comprehensive crisis of legitimacy. And Asian financial crisis created so much doubt in globalization. It created so much doubt and fear of the International Monetary Fund. It created so much doubt and fear and exposed the machinations of the US Treasury Department. It created a realization that the banks were not there for anybody, and George Soros was not there for anybody, and that the financial corporations were not there for anybody but themselves. And it showed in Asia and many other parts of the world that indeed what came with globalization was not prosperity, but crisis. Globalization and crisis were synonymous. And that was the lesson of the Asian financial crisis. Now, what happened was that crisis of global finance went immediately into Russia, into Brazil. A year and a half later, the big crisis of global finance hit Wall Street, and it is now also being played out in Argentina. So basically, what has happened is that we have had a continuous financial crisis brought about by the globalization of capital markets since 1997. And when you look at it really, if you look back just in the last 12 years, now that we have experienced the Asian financial crisis and all these crises, what we've had, in fact, is that since the early 1990s and the late 1980s, ever since they began to dissolve the barriers that prevented the free flow of capital, in fact, we've had at least 12 major financial crises which has happened since then. Globalization does not mean smoothness. Globalization does not mean prosperity. Globalization means instability. Globalization means crisis. Globalization means the spread of poverty. Globalization means the spread of inequality. And if anybody doubts that, just go and ask those once powerful, once rich countries in Asia that have now hurtled back into the third world because of the mechanisms of globalization. That was the bitter lesson of the Asian financial crisis, which then began to push and spread further this crisis of legitimacy. Now, after the Asian financial crisis, people began to look at these institutions and began to look at their record. And it was very interesting what happened then, because the United Nations and many other agencies had for a long time been telling us in one UN report after another that a disaster of major proportions has been created in Latin America and in Africa by structural adjustment programs. These were the programs that were imposed by the IMF and the World Bank on over 90 developing countries and transition economies in the 1980s and early 1990s. But there were facts. In fact, inequality was increasing in Africa and Latin America. In fact, poverty was increasing. In fact, these economies were stagnant. They were not growing. And yet somehow those facts were not realities. There is a very interesting phenomenon here, whereby facts, in fact, remain just facts until there is a shift in the context, then they become realities. Before the Asian financial crisis, the crisis of stagnation, poverty, and inequality in Latin America brought about by structural adjustment administered by the IMF were purely facts. After the Asian financial crisis, suddenly they in fact became realities. That indeed, what the IMF and the World Bank had been visiting in these countries in the name of global capital, in the name of Washington, had been a disaster of unmitigated proportions. So the IMF, which used to be the knight, the charger, the knight with the long lance that was disciplining the world, the third world, all in the name of economic sobriety, suddenly all that armor was off. And the IMF spun into a crisis of legitimacy from which it has not yet recovered. The World Bank. People looked not only at the IMF, they began to look at the World Bank. And many had this image that the World Bank was going around the world doing good. That this was the biggest multilateral agency and that basically it was resolving the world's problems with poverty, that it was the big point man in the war against poverty. What happened? After 1997, the World Bank became exposed as doing anything but solving poverty. That indeed this agency had become a big bureaucracy that was mainly interested in imposing the rules of neoclassical liberal economics on the world in order to facilitate the penetration of third world countries of the South by global capital. They had a great, and they continue to have this president, Jim Wolfensohn, a great talker, somebody who can sit down many people, and in fact he was able somehow to persuade some NGOs, and Njoki knows who some of these NGOs are, that he was out to solve the problems of the world, and please come over NGOs, work with me World Bank, as we commonly solve the problems of the world, and don't listen to those critics of the bank that really are not interested in anything else but criticizing us. Well, in February of the year 2000, there emerged a report put out by the US Congress, a commission made up of liberals and conservatives, not radicals. And the conclusion of this commission was that the so-called Meltzer Commission, after Alan Meltzer, who headed up the Meltzer Commission, this commission came up with a conclusion that the World Bank is irrelevant to the solutions to solving the problem of world poverty. That the World Bank had become a big bureaucracy that had lost its way, that the World Bank had become an agency of the United States in terms of perpetrating wrong economic policies in the world. And if you read the Meltzer Commission report, it was like reading Susan George. It was like reading books put out by the Institute for Food and Development Policy, Food First. It was like reading Kevin Danaher and Medea Benjamin. Basically, I could not understand it. I mean, I was extremely pleased. Suddenly, what we had been saying for years and years and years had now become the accepted wisdom. And this coming from sections of the US establishment. It was all very interesting. Jeffrey Sachs, this big Harvard economist, the fellow who went to Bolivia, the fellow who was responsible for the shock therapy in the early 1990s in the Soviet Union, Jeffrey Sachs suddenly turns around and he says, you guys were right all along. The IMF and its policies is really screwing up developing economies. And the IMF has become a plague that must be opposed. Jeffrey Sachs. There was also this economist from Colombia, supposed to be one of the prime free trade intellectuals, Jagdish Bhagwati. What did he say? A year and a half ago, in an issue of Foreign Affairs, he said that Washington's policies were now being pushed by what he called the IMF Wall Street complex. And that this IMF Wall Street complex was not promoting economic stability, but in fact promoting instability throughout the world. And then we saw recently, again, in the last few years,